Now available in paperback and coming to Kindle Unlimited. John Haynes, Dark Succubus. The man who rules the world is tempted by a sultry succubus in this all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Dark Succubus in paperback or pre-order on Kindle Unlimited today. Hollywood is in the fourth year of a box office slump, and it looks like 2019 may possibly be the worst year for Hollywood as related to movies overall. Now, 2019 has seen the box office go down a significant percentage, and many of the films that they believed were going to be hits have either underperformed or have become complete box office failures. And I haven't seen a summer this bad since the summer of 1990. Now, back in 1990, Hollywood was anticipating big money in the aftermath of the success of 1989's Batman, which was the #1 film of that year, and several other films that were big hits, like When Harry Met Sally. And in 1990, they were anticipating 3 films becoming major box office hits. One was Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, directed by Paul Verhoeven. The second was RoboCop 2, which was directed by Empire Strikes Back director Irwin Kershner and written by Frank Miller. And the third was Dick Tracy, which was produced by Warren Beatty. Unfortunately, all 3 of those films underperformed, and Hollywood was scrambling looking for answers because they thought that the sequel summer was going to be big, and they thought that the sequel summer of 1990 was going to give them a repeat performance as related to the numbers they got back in 1989. And a lot of those executives were scratching their heads when Total Recall, a film that was supposed to make $200 million, underperformed, and a film, RoboCop 2, underperformed as well. And Dick Tracy barely got to the $100 million mark. So a lot of these movie executives, they were terrified because if they couldn't get these films to perform well, they feared that they were going to be in a slump similar to the one that they had in the 1960s and the 1970s, late 1960s and 1970s, when the audience shifted its perspective and didn't want to see musicals or epic movies about war because the Vietnam War was going on and the baby boomers' taste for films had completely changed. However, there was one bright spot that did save Hollywood back in 1990 as the audience walked away from underperforming films like RoboCop 2, Total Recall, and Dick Tracy. What we saw was the return of interest in rom-coms with Pretty Woman, a film that came out in the spring of 1990 and turned out to be a blockbuster. And then later on, we saw the film Ghost with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore go on to become the #1 film of the year, making $252, I believe, million at the time. And that was the thing that saved Hollywood back in 1990 and gave them an opportunity to go out here and regroup from the failures of underperforming films like RoboCop and Total Recall and Dick Tracy, and really made them start to rethink a lot of their superhero movies and rethink a lot of their numbers as related to films. Because when you had those rom-coms like Pretty Woman and Ghost, the supernatural thriller, do well, it really allowed Hollywood to start thinking about bringing in films of other genres like romantic comedies, which were a staple of the 1990s, and romances and as a staple in the 90s, because that's how we got those films, even though Hollywood in 91 started gambling again and went heavy with movies like Dying Young, which flopped, but they had Terminator 2 Judgment Day. But the 21st century Hollywood doesn't seem to be able to understand how to adapt after these failures and underperforming films. And they can't seem to find a strategy to overcome the numerous films that have failed over the last 3 to 4 years. Now, as someone who has studied the entertainment industry, I can see where a lot of the problems are lying. And one of the problems that they're having is, like in 1990, they are relying too much on these franchise films, and they are believing that the franchises are going to go on forever. This was a mistake they made with RoboCop. This is a mistake they made with stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger with Total Recall. And this is a mistake that has been plaguing Hollywood because they have gotten too comfortable with franchises like the MCU. They've gotten too comfortable with franchises like Toy Story. They've gotten too comfortable with old franchises, not understanding about the law of diminishing returns, nor do they understand about franchise depreciation, because as a franchise gets older, the audience is growing older with it. And this is the big mistake that Hollywood has made as related to these franchise films. They don't understand with each passing film you produce, the audience gets older, the concept gets older, and the audience starts to outgrow the concept. And this is where people are talking about sequelitis like back in 1990, and they're talking about franchise fatigue today. But you have to understand basic business to understand that a franchise, as it gets older, again, the audience gets older, and as the audience gets older, they start to get more sophisticated taste, and that's why they start to lose interest in these films. So that's where I see a big problem with Hollywood, which is still trying to go out here and mine old 1980s and 1990s franchises like your Men in Black, like your Star Wars, and your Godzilla, and many other properties, not understanding that it was a whole different generation that watched those properties, and now that generation that watched those properties, they are in their mid-40s and their 50s, and you're trying to appeal to an audience of primarily teenagers and young adults, and those people don't see the value in these characters. They never grew up with these characters, so for them, a concept like Ghostbusters is foreign to them because they spent their young years watching Danny Phantom fight ghosts. So when they look at Ghostbusters, they see it as their father's or even their grandfather's heroes, so they don't identify with those characters or relate to those characters. And in some cases of extremely older properties, they see, like Godzilla, they see it as their great-grandfather's properties. And Hollywood is still trying to go out here and mine these old properties instead of making efforts to go out and create brand new properties. Because this is why I believe Hollywood is in a slump as related to movies and franchises, is the over-reliance on the MCU and the over-reliance on old intellectual properties, believing that they have the same value that they did back in 1987, 1977, and even 1997 in the case of Men in Black International. All of these concepts are over 20, 25, 30, 40, 45, even 50 years old, and most kids today don't want to see their father's heroes or their grandfather's heroes like we did back in the 80s. And back then, they tried to bring out the Lone Ranger and Tarzan, and after those movies tanked, Hollywood executives realized they could no longer make those characters viable for cinematic properties and expect big returns after they took huge losses on those characters, and they shelved them for a time and realized that they needed to come up with brand new stuff And in the 80s, they came up with a boatload of new stuff with small budgets, like the Terminator movie, which only cost $6 million at the time, Goonies, and many other properties, because they realized that the old properties could no longer sell to people. And with Star Wars ending in 83, they needed to go out here and create new properties and new characters for a new generation. And in this 21st century, this is what needs to be done to get Hollywood out of a box office slump that has gone on for going on 5 years. Unfortunately, the infrastructure to go out here and create those small budget movies that became 80s classics is no longer there, thanks to the telecommunications bill of 1996. Because thanks to the telecommunications bill of 1996, what has gone on is we've had a consolidation of media companies, and because we have a consolidation of media companies, like the recent Disney-Fox merger, we no longer have the small studios like Touchstone or New Line Cinema to go out here and produce the smaller budgeted films like Your House Party, like many of the Jason and Freddy movies, and many of the movies like Pretty Woman that the studios did on small budgets with no-name actors. And it was those small budget movies with those B and C list actors that became the blockbusters, and it was those small budget movies that turned into the classics. So we don't have that infrastructure in Hollywood anymore, and the primary focus of Hollywood these days is making these big budget movies on these old franchises, and that because they're focused on making these big budget movies on old franchises, this is why these films just aren't working. And when you compound the problem of old properties and old stories with the new social justice narrative, you have a recipe for disaster where people just aren't interested in going to see these movies, because instead of entertaining us with a story, what we're getting is a film that is meant to preach to us and promote ideologies to us. And that's something people aren't going to pay money to see, because people go to a movie to escape their problems and escape the troubles that they're having in their life, and possibly maybe find a solution to some of their problems. But you can't do that with today's Hollywood films, because too many of the people in Hollywood are in a bubble, and because they don't experience reality or understand reality, they want to come out here and preach social justice narratives to you, or preach ultra-feminist narratives to you. And it's this type of narrative that alienates people, because people did not go to the movies to be preached to. They go to be entertained. They go to escape. They go to watch movies that make them laugh. They go to watch movies that have lots of action and adventure. And they're not getting that from today's Hollywood the same way people weren't getting it from the Hollywood of 1990. Unfortunately, unlike the Hollywood of 1990 or the Hollywood of the early 1970s, none of today's Hollywood executives know how to adapt, and none of them have an interest in going outside of the box. When it comes down to today's Hollywood, many of the executives are insecure, many of them are cheap, and many of them do not want to go out here and spend the money creating brand new properties for a new audience, or pay creators fair compensation for new properties for their new audience, just like Warner Brothers did when they started hearing that Vertigo comic properties were being turned into films, and that they would have to pay those creators fair compensation. So they don't want to go out here and make a millionaire out of a comic pro or a writer these days. And because they don't want to pay for those film and TV rights, they want to go out here and rehash the same old concepts, not understanding that the audience that grew up with those concepts is now old and no longer can, and the new audience no longer sees these characters as relatable to them or their experiences, because a 1970s or a 1960s or a 1980s character is not relatable to a kid who grew up as Gen Y, a kid who grew up as a millennial, or a kid who grew up in Gen Z, a world that is completely different than the world of the 70s, a world that is completely different than the world of the 80s, a world that is completely different than the world of the 90s, the world of the 2000s, or the world of the 2010s, a world that is more digital, a world that has more technology, a world that has social media. These types of stories that we produced in the 70s, 80s, and 90s come from a completely different era, and there's no real way to modify them because those eras were completely different. But you can't tell Hollywood executives that as they try to continue to push your Star Wars on people, they try to push your Men in Black and many other old concepts, not understanding that the audience changed just like the audience changed back in the late 60s when they were still trying to do those musicals and epic movies, not understanding that their world was completely different. And if it wasn't for guys like Tom Laughlin, who came out with Born Losers and appealed to the biker culture and created the first blockbuster, and Melvin Van Peebles, who created Sweetback, we wouldn't have had a revival of Hollywood, because it was those two gritty films that opened the door for different types of films like The Godfather, which Hollywood hated and didn't really like, but turned out to be a classic, and many other films that changed the way we saw film in the 70s and changed the way we saw television in the 70s. And we need that type of revolution now in the 21st century. Unfortunately, thanks to the Telecommunications Bill of 1996 that Bill Clinton signed and the Republicans passed, we have a consolidation of media that has led to the complete, as I see it, decline of Hollywood, because these studios, now run by oligarchs, they're not as flexible. They don't have the subdivisions anymore to go out here and create new films with small budgets, or go out here and create new properties, because back in the 80s and the 70s, we had most of these franchises that you see, your Halloweens, your Friday the 13th, your RoboCops, many of those properties, Rocky, all those franchises were made with small budgets. I mean, under maybe $10, $15 million, and those films turn out to be blockbusters. And we don't have that type of infrastructure anymore, because Fox and Disney, when they merged, went out here and laid off a bunch of people at their smaller divisions. And I don't believe Touchstone is around anymore, Fox Searchlight, and many of these small divisions, they are no longer around. And because they're not around, this is why we don't have any more innovation in Hollywood. And all we're getting is superhero movies. And as I see it right now, the superhero movie and the sci-fi franchise movie is turning into the new musical and the new epic movie. And I believe it may lead to the complete collapse of Hollywood, because they don't have the infrastructure to go out here and adapt like they did in 1990, nor do they have the infrastructure to go out here and turn on a dime, because the minute they start going out here and have those, back in the day, we had those type of infrastructure, and they could go out here and produce films in genres like comedy and create films in other genres like romantic comedy. But because we don't have that infrastructure, we don't have those films to go out here and be successes when other films fail. Because if it wasn't, again, for Ghost back in 1990 and Pretty Woman, Hollywood would have suffered one of its worst years in 1990. And when I look at 2019, I see a mirror of 1990 and a mirror of that time. And what's sad is that Hollywood has not learned anything in the last 25, 30 years as related to the business. And because they haven't learned anything about the business of film, it looks like they're on the road to going out of business sooner rather than later. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, the Spinsterella trilogy, and my men's issues books, you may also do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. There you can pick up my books in paperback and ebook. And that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam Goddess of. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a demonic dominatrix in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Goddess of in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.